we could fly.
This is your summer. That means Six Flags and the taste of an ice-cold Coca-Cola. We're talking thrilling coasters, delicious burgers, real moments together, and this. Coke is summer refreshment when you need it most, so you can hop on another ride. This is your summer. Six Flags and Coca-Cola. Come make it yours. Visit sixflags.com/Coke to save up to $20 off passes, plus daily tickets starting at $44.99.
Hey everyone, just before the podcast starts, I wanted to tell you that we're starting a new thing on our Patreon where people and guests have a few extra questions at the end of the podcast that I ask them and provide as a patron-only bonus. You should go to patreon.com/HEGELBON. That's Hagelbon. And that's the No Cartridge Audio Patreon. If you donate $5 or more, you will get access to all of these bonuses. They're about 15 minutes for every single podcast. So there's about, 30 to 40 minutes per week. And, maybe more or less every time, and some, bonus episodes. There's all sorts of stuff you'll be able to get, but just head on over. There'll be some extra stuff from Felix this week, and more to come from there. So thanks so much, and enjoy the show. Welcome to No Cartridge Audio. My name is Trevor Strunk, Hagelbon on Twitter, and I'm very pleased to have with me today Felix Biederman, at By Your Logic, and 1/6 of Chapo Trap House. Felix, welcome.
Hey, Drew. Thanks for having me, man.
Yeah, of course. Absolutely. You want to tell us, in your own words, what you're here to talk with us about today?
So today we are talking about one of my favorite subjects, Metal Gear Solid, but specifically, as Trevor's told me, from a theoretical standpoint, about whether the games are sort of a jingo, pro-war, war fetishization games, as many of the great canonical World War II and then later generalized warfare games are from the West, or if it's a protest game. My opinion, I think Metal Gear Solid is, as a series, it has one of those things that you see in all great fiction. You see it in The Sopranos. You see it in The Wire or whatever, and other non-prestige TV things where I'd say a plurality of the audience enjoys them on this surface level. Like, say, with The Sopranos, people love it when they tell funny jokes and they get laid and they shoot people and have cool fights. And with Metal Gear, it's something similar, where there are these beautiful, dramatic set pieces, especially in the last two installments of the series. These incredibly dramatic scenes of warfare and infiltration and espionage. And it's, it has this very anime over-the-topness that people really like, and these very memorable characters. And the gameplay is thrilling and always has been. The first game was incredibly cutting edge at the time. And going into the last one, the last of the series for now, Metal Gear Solid 5, maybe the greatest stealth game I have ever played in my life. Incredible, seamless, fun, whether you're doing shootouts, you're infiltrating, you're taking it slow, whatever you're doing. But it has the second level. And I think one of the tells in the second level is something that you see in these aforementioned works of art where the creator is giving you a nod that this isn't what it seems. I think there is a central joke to the Metal Gear series that is, amidst the life and death seriousness, the core anti-nuclear proliferation, anti-authoritarianism message of the series. There's a joke that hinges on things, and the joke is the Metal Gears themselves. Now, in every single game, there's a new Metal Gear coming, and it's hyped as this is going to change everything. In the games that are set during the Cold War, say the Shadagohad in Metal Gear Solid 3, it's brought to us as this will give the hardliners a push to take over the Soviet government, and it will totally change the balance of the Cold War because it can, unlike a silo-fired ICBM, it's a mobile tank with its own defense system, and it can fire from wherever. It can't be traced. Holy shit, this hardline faction has a hold of it. They've been secretly funding it. In Metal Gear Solid 1, we have a similar type of thing, except it's a rogue contingent who's gotten this. In Metal Gear Solid 2, it's the seizure of the Metal Gears that are not equipped with nukes, but are purposed to hunt down the Metal Gear Rex that everyone has a blueprint for now. And then the Arsenal Gear, which is so powerful for its manipulation of information. But the central joke in all of these is that they're always taken down by a single guy with a rocket launcher. Maybe he has some help, as Solid Snake did from Gray Fox in Metal Gear Solid 1. But still, that's only 2 people taking down what is supposed to be an unkillable weapon. And I think that's a very clever joke about military R&D, think about all these bloated, insane pork barrel projects that don't even return that much employment, but are just mostly paying the salaries of executives and lobbyists and other bagmen, things like the F-35, stuff of that nature. It's a joke that we put so much stake into creating these weapons for these conflicts that no one in their right mind would ever want us to happen, that we should be working to prevent from happening. That we would ever have a conflict where we're going to be having dogfights between modern fighters to establish air supremacy. Right. That would be a war against China or Russia, except we put literal trillions of dollars into that event. And it turns out these things don't work that well. The F-35 is kind of a piece of shit, as are many of these other.
Right, that's the massively expensive one that they basically decided was just didn't work.
Yes. The point is, these are dangerous weapons, and they play into very dangerous motives and ideologies. But the military-industrial complex is so bloated and contradictory. It's a sick man of an institution that it just takes a determined guy with a rocket launcher at the end of the day every time.
Yeah, it's really interesting because I was in prep for talking with you. It sort of speaks to 2 things. So in prep for talking with you, I wasn't replaying the games. I was rewatching the intro cinematics. In a lot of ways, I remember 2 things about Metal Gear when I was growing up. And the one was when Metal Gear Solid came out, what you said, how revolutionary it was. I remember my friends talking about it and just being kind of I was, in tune with games at that point, and I just had never heard of anything like it. And there were a lot of games that were supposed to be like that. I remember Parasite Eve was supposed to be like that, and it really wasn't. But Metal Gear Solid was the one that really changed everything. And then in Metal Gear Solid 2, my buddy who was super into the Metal Gear Solid games would just go on and on about how important that opening cinematic with Snake and the rain is, with the Harry who's the composer?
Oh, Harry Gregson Williams.
Yeah, Harry Gregson Williams in the background, and just the over the topness of it. And so I went back and watched them a little, and really all I could think about, watching the one from 2 and then watching 5. Obviously, it's different. In 2, it's a much more sort of heroic intro, and in the intro to Ground Zeroes, it's the introduction of the main villain and just the abnegation of humanity in the face of war. But in both instances, the first instance, it's Snake and at the end Raiden, and it's one man against all the odds. And in the second one, it's one man is the key to this overarching impossible organization. And you're right. I mean, even looking at it as an adult now, I'm thinking the complexity of the plot and the complexity of the conspiracy behind the plot is that's the point. It's funny. It is a dark joke.
Yeah, and the stuff that we can, when I played it as a kid, I knew that a lot of it was stuff about, imperialism and proliferation and the military-industrial complex, but I still found myself, worshiping Snake and then Big Boss as these incredible heroes. But when I went back and played Metal Gear Solid 2 especially, you see, this is another great joke of the series. That let's go all the way back to Big Boss. Big Boss was never really Big Boss. When we finally see Big Boss outside of, a few pixels and some dialogue boxes, as we did in the original games, he's confused, he's sad, he's hurt, he's just constantly at mercy of this mother-like figure. And later, as we play Peace Walker, then Ground Zeroes, and especially 5, we find out Big Boss was never Big Boss. And in Metal Gear Solid 2, we find out Solid Snake was never really Solid Snake. No one was really anyone, because they were either going, putting on their own ruse, as Snake or as Big Boss does in Phantom Pain. They were sort of purposed and predestined into this role as Big Boss was, into the role of boss after the events of 3.
Right.
They were, they were at the right place at the right time, as Solid Snake refers to the events of Shadow Moses. When we see him again in Metal Gear Solid 2, we encounter his Raiden. He tells us directly, there's no such thing as a legend. It's someone's memory. And if there's a lot of very key dialogue between the Emmerichs in that game later on. And do you remember when they're talking about, when Raiden and Emma Emmerich are talking about DNA, and Raiden says, well, of course,
yes.
we have this, we have this information, these researchers have verified it, and Emma goes, what, have you counted them yourselves? Have you looked at individual DNA strands? If you change what the original thing is that they're lying about, you'll never even you don't even know what the truth is to compare it to the lie. And that's Snake. Snake commits heroic acts in the canon of Metal Gear Solid 1. The correct ending is that he saves Meryl. But he happened to be, nothing was as it seemed. He ended up not doing what he thought he was going to do. He acted as valorously as he could, but as he points out, he's also just a hired killer. He doesn't know how to do anything else, so how much of a hero is he? And what do you compare him to? And what is he supposed to be in this context where nothing is true because we have no reference point? We live in this flooding of information that no one actually controls. The Patriots couldn't keep Rex from getting out there. They sowed the seeds of their own destruction. In the same way that any deep state grows like an infection, it also sows the seeds of its own destruction by becoming so Byzantine and insane and having so many moving parts in its plans. But
yeah, no, I think that's right. You even think about like the news of the day with James Comey getting fired, which, since I'm not going to put this out today, it's going to date this episode, but that's okay. But you think about the lack of understanding one actually has as to what that does to a structure like the FBI, or what exactly that would mean to something like the FBI. You understand sort of the immediate kind of cruelty or arbitrariness of the act, but in terms of next man up, in terms of okay, how does this affect the structure of various ops happening all around us all the time? You're right. It's Byzantine. It's not. It's gone from secret to almost like a double blind. The left hand doesn't know what the right's doing, and that ends up being again, as you say, just part of its own self abnegation.
Yeah, and that Metal Gear Solid 2, if you go back and play it now with the expectation of what we expect in controls and features in a modern stealth game, you'll find it lacking in some ways unless you have a particular affection for the game. But I really do think it is the key to the entire series. The prequels,
absolutely, and
it informs the prequels more than the prequels inform it. It is entirely about identity, the fungibility of identity, the malleability of ourselves, and it was so ahead of its time. It came out, it came out in 2002, and it was so ahead of its time because, our vision of a totalitarian state and their control of information at that point was restricting everything. It was creating a choke point where very little information could emanate out, and you could only get a little bit, and it was all filtered through them. And you were just in the dark about everything. It was sort of, the Orwell 1984 vision of what authoritarianism is. But
Right.
this was so ahead of its time because it saw the crisis of too much information, the crisis of, it's like if you were sailing and you set your sail just maybe 2 degrees off than you would have originally. You sail long enough, you were so far fucking beyond that point, you don't even know how to get back.
Yeah.
And so it puts forth this AI and information system where there is no truth to begin with. It's slightly altered just enough, but there's just information all over the place, and there's so much to consume. There is so little of life that is certain anymore that there is no such thing as truth anymore. And how can you know who you're rebelling against? How can you know what you're agitating towards? I mean, Solid Snake knows more than anyone, almost, besides Ocelot in that game. And even he doesn't know. We don't find out until the end that the Patriots are all dead, that this is an AI system. Ocelot knows more than anyone, but he has to literally become insane to manipulate the system, as he did,
Right.
which he does in 4. Yeah.
It's fascinating too, because like a lot of what I like to think about with Kojima, I know this is like, I have this weird fetish or quirk with game series like this. If I come to them late, and I came to Metal Gear Solid late, like I like to play the first game in the series first, and like sometimes I'll go back too far. And so I remember when I was in college, I played a ROM of of Metal Gear, like the NES game. I don't know if you've bothered playing through that or not.
I played an emulator of it once.
Yeah, it's beyond clunky. But what's fascinating about watching Kojima grow from that, and it's becoming even more interesting as I've learned more about him. But like, thinking about Kojima as like sort of like an auteur, starting with that, you have the seeds of the extraordinarily complex kind of, and I find it convincing, framework you're laying out there. But I mean, ultimately, the original Metal Gear is just like a Twilight Zone episode. Like you're following Big Boss's orders the whole time, and then at the end, you find out Big Boss was the bad guy all along. And it's just like it's just a classic kind of Twilight Zone or James Patterson or Tom Clancy kind of turn, where like, oh, what you thought was true wasn't true. But then like he does the MSX game, the original Metal Gear Solid, and then he does Snatcher on, I don't even remember what Snatcher was on.
I've never played it. I'm fascinated by it, but I've never played it.
It's a totally cool game, and it's very frustrating. It's much more like a visual novel than anything else he's produced. But Snatcher gets at, like, Snatcher basically takes that kind of hokey, weird twist ending and makes it like, and actually kind of infuses real world politics into it by way of like AI and robots in a way that doesn't look anything like Metal Gear Solid. But it's fascinating to watch him take something that is just a germ early on, and a germ he's like admittedly not happy with, and like mature it up through until he gets to something like, Metal Gear Solid 2, Metal Gear Solid 5, like all of these sort of high watermarks in the series where his vision actually like takes a step forward or evolves into something different. I don't know how often you see that in video games.
Yeah, well, very rarely someone gets as much time with one thing as Kojima did.
Oh, that's true.
I also think, though, that he's an unusual mind for games. He's a very strange person, but he's kind of lost in that sea of information. When you play Metal Gear Solid 5, it's, as I said, an incredible game, and parts of the plot I really love, but it's very clearly unfinished, and most of that is problems with Konami itself. But it's also like you can tell that he got so into the 80s theme that he gets lost at certain points.
That's interesting. I mean, it's interesting because like you can draw parallels too with the kind of like governmental bloat too, because by the time Kojima's doing like the later Metal Gears, and I know he has the falling out with Konami, but like, I mean, by this point, and by the point he's making those games, he's essentially like, in terms of video game developer status, he's essentially like the 1,000-pound elephant in the room. Like, if you get him, you know you're going to turn a profit, which is of course why he sets out on his own. But like, he's also so temperamental, so seemingly arbitrary, so like, baroque in his designs, that it becomes sort of like this faith that you have to have in him, that like, okay, yeah, he's going to produce something good. And him getting lost just seems like such an interesting way for that to kind of crumble.
There's a very interesting reflection of art in life there, because Kojima, in his motives, in his grand vision, in what he wants the game to be, and even sometimes when you first play them, as people did Metal Gear Solid 2, I remember many people hating Metal Gear Solid 2 because they hated that they were fooled and had to play as Raiden. But the farther they get from it, the more the general consensus becomes, this is brilliant. This is the most brilliant game ever. This predicted our modern age. And in a sense, I think Kojima is closest to Ocelot in that way. Because the entire time you see Ocelot, you go, well, none of his motives really make sense unless you ascribe that he just likes to hurt people or something, or that he just likes to be able to change the world around him. But the farther you go, oh, I see what he wanted. And it's not immediately apparent. And Konami is, as any corporation or large institution, is close to the Patriots. Making the Patriots an AI system, the GWAI system, is such an interesting way of explaining that institutional supergrowth and rot, that it is literally removed from any human characteristics, that the only reason it exists is to perpetuate itself. And I think that's an interesting commentary on dispersion of responsibility and the what ends up as just uselessness of these institutions, where all they do is justify their existence, as the CIA or anything does. And so that little interplay, but they needed each other. Kojima needed their resources. They needed Kojima's abilities to generate money, and it ended up being a very odd reflectory thing.
Yeah, and you think about like the way that, like, even thinking about like the term Patriots, right? I doubt at this point in time, just because it hadn't really grown into that sort of cottage industry, but it's ironic or sort of prescient in the way that it predicts games like, the Call of Duty series or the Battlefield series. Like, I had someone ask me the other day if I was going to play the new Call of Duty, and like, I haven't played a Call of Duty in a long time. Not because like I'm uninterested in them, but just because like I feel like I've played a lot of them already. But like, they were saying, oh, it's anti-war, or tries to be, like, you think a game could be anti-war. And there's just like, in a certain way, it strikes me that like those are just repetitions. They're their own sort of self-proliferation. And so like in the back of your mind, you're always thinking like, is this game, I touched a little bit on this in a previous episode, but like, is this game actually doing anti-war to do anti-war? Like, is this a statement it's making, or is this just like it's understanding that it has to change things up in order to keep selling games, in order to perpetuate itself? Like, is it actually saying something about humanity, or is it just like an algorithm?
I think, well, first, that's an interesting point. I mean, the Call of Duty games are like, it's like if the Patriot AI training programs or virtual reality training programs were just things that we could buy, more or less. I mean, we later found out that the army was using it for recruitment in a lot of cases. But I think they're less about war than people might imagine, just looking at it head on. It is a game a lot about war. They say a lot about war. They talk a lot about the uselessness of war itself, even though we do love these characters because of their participation and accomplishments in war. I think some of its anti-war commentary is the commentary on those players. It builds these characters up, rather, and makes us love them. because of their idiosyncrasies, but also the really cool things they do. We saw more of that as they began to master the art and technology in those cutscenes more, especially those CQC scenes in Metal Gear Solid 3. But
right.
They build them up, and then they show you the characters to be essentially powerless. They're pawns of this sort of invisible, bloodless organism of a deep state. They're fools in the end, in a lot of cases, and they're not themselves. They only get to be, a lot of what we think is so cool about them just turns out to be them doing exactly what they were purposed to do by this distant group of elders and these vastly unaccountable institutions. I mean, what are we told at the beginning of the primary part of Metal Gear Solid 3? The CIA is going to kill us if we fuck this up. What do we see at the end? The fix was always in. They wanted Big Boss to do this, to kill the boss. What do we see at the end of the series? It turns out that, Skullface was just following Big Boss around, cleaning up after him. How much of this was real? Was Big Boss the only hope? Were they training him to replace Boss, to be this hero, this icon, someone they could depend on, someone they could even sacrifice like they did the Boss? What was the point of all this? Right. We'll never really know.
And I guess that's like kind of the point, right? Like, so I two things come up from that, but the first is kind of like a garden path, so I'll just get it out of the way. I remember a lot of so when you say like people were mad about Metal Gear Solid 2 when it came out, one of the things I remember is totally that Raiden thing. People felt duped. I remember that vividly. And then also people were mad about the plot. Like, I remember it was back when I read like Penny Arcade, which, I mean, thank God I grew out of that. But I remember they made a comic where they tried to like draw the plot line or something like that. It was like the main joke was like, this doesn't make sense. And like ultimately it feels like a ridiculous comment at this point where you're just like, of course it doesn't make sense. Like, that's kind of that's the idea, right? Like what deep state, like when we get declassified deep state information, it doesn't make any less sense than the conspiracy theories in the real world.
Right.
So like, yeah, why would it ever make sense?
Yeah, read the Church Report. The Church Report is, an amazing thing to read. The Senate report, Special Subcommittee on Assassinations and Intelligence by Senator Frank Church from Idaho, one of the last great Western lefties. But it revealed a lot of really creepy stuff that we did in a lot of countries during the Cold War, especially in South America. And you were shocked, people at the time were shocked and disgusted, but they were also going, God, all this shit we were doing is pretty stupid. And a lot of it didn't work. We just killed a lot of people, but we didn't accomplish the grander evil goal we were going for in a lot of cases. We just didn't know what we were doing, but we had all this power to kill and prop things up and tear them down.
Yeah, knowing that it's like actually people doing it that like are just as, I don't know, flawed and inefficient as the rest of us is like, it's definitely like, to use a cliche, like the actual horror of the whole thing is that. But it's also kind of the as you put it, like the salient point. Yeah,
and going back to the conceit of the Patriots as an AI system in the end, I think that's again, that's a great illustration of the horror that they are real people. That when we see the totality of their actions, it is like they're just AIs who only act in a way that would necessitate their continued use and dominance. And yeah, it's not supposed to make a lot of sense at all. It's when you play Metal Gear Solid 2, the theme, and this was brought to us as the theme of Metal Gear Solid 3, but I felt it was way more the theme in 2 because you felt surrounded. And the theme of 2 to me, as the player, the playing experience seemed to be surviving. You know, when I was in Big Shell, you're just the view of the camera. You feel like the entire structure is coming down on you. You are surrounded by sentries. Especially when you're in Arsenal gear and you're literally crawling through the bowels of this horrifying Leviathan. And the segments are named like, colon A, colon B, shit like that. You're literally naked, running around, just hoping no one sees you. If they do, you hope you can kick them over a railing or something and just sprint 2 rooms down. You've given up finding out the whole conspiracy, and you just go, shit, I just want to make it out of here. When you get to the famous part where you fight the Metal Gears, unlike in previous games, you just have to keep shooting at them until your character gives up because he can't do it anymore. He just can't. It's too many of them. These mass-produced killer mechs. And you just, it's thrilling and it's an exhilarating game. And the viewer, wants to find out more. You never quite feel like you're finding out enough. But when you're playing, you're like, fuck, I just want to make it out of here. I want to survive. I want to make it.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Like, that's great. Like it's funny too, thinking about the ways that Kojima's work has also, or I guess like, maybe not just Kojima, but like the whole team behind it, really kind of predicted some contemporary gaming tropes too. Like that kind of feeling of survival or exhaustion is used a lot to really good effect these days. And like the feeling of just like total exposure or being vulnerable. I think that's like just like a very well accepted trope now. But in 2002, I mean, that was like the height of overpowered gaming.
Yeah.
Like, that wasn't done. I mean, maybe like Resident Evil, maybe a survival horror game. But if you were doing a survival horror game, you were doing that. Like, this idea of doing both is just, it didn't happen.
And you would never have had something like that in a war game at the time, really. Like,
oh no, absolutely.
Later, like a few years on, when they had one of the most acclaimed single campaign missions from Call of Duty back when it was more emphasis on campaign than multiplayer, was that Point du Hoc mission. And there is a little bit of that helplessness there, but it's sort of cheap things. Like, you're experiencing this scene from first person, you can't really do anything. Then you're in the game, then you're killing everyone. And you're just as powerful as you've always been.
Right.
You can take them.
Yeah, it's not about making choices.
Yeah, no, not at all. You do it the exact same way after that little thing. And I think it's almost like Kojima was a benevolent dictator. It's like, in this time, you need an enlightened despot like Napoleon or Maria Theresa, because they're the only person that can holistically create that vision of a game and, get everyone to build this theme later on in the game where it's like, okay, I want you to feel powerless, but it's not so much that the gameplay is totally different, unless in, counting one stage. It's just you feel it. And yeah, like, I mean, you play any war game now. Well, I've been playing Battlefield, and I've been playing the campaign a bit, and there are so many of these scenes where you're supposed to feel powerless. At the beginning of the game, you run through this thing where you just get killed, where it's impossible for you to win. And it's cool, and it's definitely way different than what we would have had a few years ago. And part of that is just, the renaissance of World War II and even World War I games and sort of reimagining them. But it will never be as novel. It will never have the wholly helpless feeling that Metal Gear Solid 2 had, ever.
I mean, there's something about like narrative there too. I think. Like, I mean, I think the story in all these games gets maligned a lot by like people who are sort of coming after it after the fact, or even people who played it at the time. It's either maligned or beloved, and there's something about it like structurally that's really interesting or really compelling. It's like, so I've brought him up before, and I'm sure I'll do it again. But he's one of the more interesting critics in terms of narrative. The Soviet critic Eric Lukács says about he talks about historical fiction. He's a real big fan of Stevenson. He loves Stevenson, and he loves Stevenson because he says look, Stevenson, the way he did it, he gives you everyone. Like, he gives you all the levels in the entire world. Like, you get kings, and you also get peasants, and they're all in the same book, and they're all living in the same totality. Stevenson he's a capitalist, he's whatever. He doesn't like his politics, but he says him or Balzac, you get everyone. You get the whole top-down system, and you get to see everyone living in it as people. And then he gets mad about later stuff because it just presents a narrative. It's not about individual characters or something like that. And in a certain way, the way you're describing Metal Gear, it makes me think Kojima kind of does the same thing. He gives you everyone from the top down, except that once you get to the top, there's a hole there. It's you sort of instead of the king, you take out the king, and it's it's an aporia. It's a black hole. It's nothing, except randomness, chaos, or something like that. And that's just even beyond gameplay. That's just such a profoundly unsettling feeling, that I think unless you're making a truly politically I don't know, rough game, if you wanted to claim that there was no sort of higher political purpose to World War II or something, which would be a risk, but interesting. Unless you're doing that, then I don't know how you're gonna replicate it.
Yeah, and just a little bit to that, the thing about the totality of all levels in this world. Going back to MGS1, and this was incredibly novel at that time, because think about what games were at that time, and think about what narrative was at that time. To have this focus on Johnny Sasaki, the guard who shit himself all the time, it was thought of as this funny thing, but it was this kind of interesting insight. If you're playing the game in the way where you killed everyone, it was all these guys are sort of misbegotten, woeful creations of science. You later find out, the genome soldiers, and they have indigestion sometimes, and they're nervous sometimes, and they're cold, and they know that they're loyal to Liquid in this way, but they're almost like children. And you think about all the ones that you've killed, and it really adds to that sense of what was the point of all this? And
right.
When you play that game, also, when you play any of the Solid Snake canon, you always had this sense of all right, where are the adults? In one, it's the colonel, and then it's then the defense secretary takes over, and then then he's been arrested. In two, they go even farther with this. In one, there was the sense that there were some that knew something, but everyone who you thought you could rely on, it wasn't that they were lying to you. They just didn't know. And they were hiding some things from you, as the Colonel did with Meryl. But with two, there is so much information going on that when you meet a new character, like Armitage, when you meet Armitage, you're like, oh, fuck, this guy's an agent for the Patriots. He's going to know everything, and we're going to get to the bottom of this. Maybe he's going to give me some super weapon that's going to help me out here. And right. You talk to him, you immediately bring up the hostages that the Colonel AI tells you about when you don't know he's an AI. And you go, they've already killed a hostage. Raiden says that. And Armitage goes, what the fuck are you talking about? And you always get those little moments in the game where someone who's supposed to present this superior authority that you think can help you out has no idea what the fuck you're talking about, because no one has the right information. And the people you think were a little bit closer, or a lot closer, as we thought Snake was in that chapter, to knowing the full thing, and just we wish would tell us, turns out they didn't know anything either. There are no adults. There are just these massive systems that we get lost in and consumed by, as we did by Arsenal Gear. And there are no adults. There are no experts. There's no one really who knows that much, and there is no truth. And we are just, all we have is each other and ourselves and our survival.
Yeah, and I mean it's yeah, no, that's fantastic. It's just interesting, like thinking about the ways that the game also gives you it keeps feeding you. I'm trying to think of the best way to say this, like tidbits of tempting logics, like where you're like, okay, I want to believe. I'm thinking back to like the trailer for or the intro for MGS2, where like you think like, okay, Snake's an unbeatable, super badass, and he's friends with Raiden and they're going to take on the world. And on some level, it gets at that camaraderie that you were talking about. But on another level, you're just like buying into the swelling music and the imagery that Kojima and all of the art direction is feeding you, knowing full well that it's going to fall apart. Or like I'm thinking of the way that Boss treats Big Boss in MGS3, like the way he looks up to her, right?
Yeah.
And the sort of like figure she's supposed to cut. There's like a desire to want that kind of figure, like to want that sort of like, leading that sort of like a figure that tells you what is right and wrong in the world, like a godlike figure or a monarch-like figure. And the game gives it to you, and in every sense just knocks it down. Just totally is like merciless about that.
Yeah, the Boss, all our encounters with Boss, she beats the shit out of our character and disarms him and taunts him for knowing nothing and says, "Go home. There's nothing for you here. You're a boy." And you are a bit intimidated by your surroundings in 3, and you go, "I wish I was as powerful as her." But then when you beat her, and one of the greatest gut-wrenching moments ever in a game, when you have to final that the final shot into her.
Yeah.
And you find out what is more horrifying. That she was just some group of shadowy, smoking old men told this incredible being, this super powerful warrior, brilliant woman, just an untold hero on the battlefield, that just some gross group of fat old guys said, "Hey, we're gonna fucking kill your kid and you if you don't do this." And she had to do it. And you go through the same thing that Big Boss does when he refuses to shake Johnson's hand, and you go, "Oh fuck, that's the world? That's the fucking world? There is nothing a hero can do to take this on." And you see that seed in Big Boss's head, where he goes, "Well, I guess I have to be the villain, or people have to think I'm the villain, or I have to do a lot of things that a villain would do, like have a body double, have this guy that I give amnesia to, that I make myself, or state that I'm a rogue nation with a nuclear-armed walking tank, or just any number of awful things that Boss does."
The way that the game plays around with like what it knows its players are going to feel about these characters. I mean, like you said, like they're just like, they're incredible, and the way they aestheticize them is just, you want to love them. You like Ocelot. I mean, he's just an incredibly appealing character, even when he's sort of like obnoxious or evil or insane or whatever. Like you want to like him, you want to like lionize him, and like that is all the more gut-wrenching when it falls apart. It's like it's a million times like giving you the best possible character that you want to be, and then saying like, "Oh yeah, actually, like it doesn't work. Like it's all bad."
Yeah, it puts you through so much. Every game, they put you through so much, and I think the feeling that you're supposed to get is kind of, this entire world, these massive superstructures are so fucking evil and make me feel so fucking helpless, and I don't know what I can do, but I hate everything they stand for. I wish we had an idea of what we could replace them with, but this is so disgusting that it can build up these individuals and make us think all these things about them, and then rip them apart or show us that they were never there to begin with, or never were what we thought they were. I think, going back to that original question, are they lionizing war? Are they anti-war? I think it's, if anything, this is sort of a treatise on imperialism, or how, structures like the military-industrial congressional complex, or things like that. It's about the inherent evil in these structures that only seek to continue themselves, and the lengths they will go to, the people they will consume and spit out to do it. And that one of the worst things they do is they make you fight them on your terms. Big Boss goes in to fight them, and he ends up with, in Metal Gear 2, he ends up with child soldiers. He ends up the entire world hating them. His story ends with this shell of a man in Zero just having to pull his plug, then dropping fucking dead. And that doesn't even, who even knows what that leads to, because there was nothing even to replace that Zero's world that he created.
Yeah, man. Oh. That's actually, I think that's I hate to even cut anything short, but I think that's a perfect ending. Because I think like there's a way in which you have to. It's rare, you want to resist in any sort of criticism, and I know you feel this way too, but you want to resist in any sort of criticism to sort of like name like great men of genius or great women of genius, or however you want to do it. It's not it's just a thing where you're just like, you don't want to say like this person is like, whatever they do is always good and whatever they say is always good, because you end up in like a bad situation. And there's been a million times where like, I'm sure you and I both, I can vouch for myself, have been like under some bad illusions of like what is good or bad art or music or whatever, just based on like loyalty to an artist. So it's like risky. But what I think is like, it's not that Kojima is a super genius. He may be, but like the art works because it's a rare video game that you actually need to like talk through the whole process to get to a seemingly simple resolution. It's very dialectical, like not to be too heady about it, but like the idea that like you start off saying like, well, it's pro-war, and you say like, well, it's anti-war, and in the end you're just like, well, both are kind of insufficient, and in fact like the contradiction it produces is like it's anti-system. It's anti sort of like, and that's just such a deeply interesting and new and novel idea that it produces, just by way of like, you have to play the games, you have to talk about the games with your friends. It's like, it's a really weird meta commentary.
Yeah, and it's not so much that Kojima is just this untouchable genius, but it speaks to the strength of holistically building this world in a way that a lot of game makers don't. A lot of them just go into it going, oh, I want to make something gritty, or I want to, I want to show what war really is, or something half-baked like that. But it shows, he's in a, I'll put it this way, in a series that is about, in the end, sort of getting drowned in information, he's the one guy who can consume all that information and at least know where he's going to, at least know what destination he's swimming to. And it's not always perfect, but it's, it's better than anyone else almost. So I'll take it.
Yeah, definitely. So you have anything to add? Anything we didn't touch on?
No, I think that's all. That is the conversation I've been wanting to have about Metal Gear for a very long time. So thank you for having me.
Well, yeah, thanks for having it. It's like it's the conversation about Metal Gear that I didn't even know I wanted to have. But yeah, it's been fascinating, been fantastic. So thanks, man. I'd ask you if you wanted to plug anything, but I think everyone already knows to listen to Chapo Trap House. Anything beyond Chapo that you want to plug?
No. Well, I have a very long essay about a very, very weird story from my life that is coming out in the next Street Fight zine. So you should definitely subscribe to Trev's Patreon, and you should subscribe to my friend Street Fight too, because
they put out some cool stuff in the zine. That's a fantastic publication.
Yeah, absolutely. So, yeah.
Cool. I'm looking forward to that.
Just want to tell people to subscribe to both of those things.
Thanks, man. Well, yeah, please come on anytime. And if if that Kojima game with Norman Reedus is any good, we'll talk about it here. I'll have you back on.
Be my pleasure.
All right, man. Well, yeah, anytime. And thanks again. And thanks for listening to No Cartridge Audio.